Previously in Uncommon, Book 1 in the Chronicles of the Common series, Ileana had asked Lucian to rejoin life in the Common, and Lucian's brother Kai had suddenly and mysteriously been brought back to life. And now, Chapter 4, Lucian. They're definitely plotting. I hadn't been prepared for this turn of events. When Kai had first risen from his mysterious coma, he was determined to take Ileana's head. Days later, they were allies plotting a coup. They still didn't entirely like each other, but they shared a goal. They wanted off this asteroid. Kai woke as if he were still standing on the barren planet of Vahara, with fists flying and panic coursing through his recently revived system. It had taken nearly an hour to convince him we were safe and the battle was long over. The blood bond we had shared since childhood had been broken, and the dramatic changes to my appearance confused him. My nose burned with the acrid scent of fear emanating from Kai, and it had driven a dagger through my heart to know that he was unable to recognize his own brother. After everything he had gone through, the last thing I wanted was for Kai to feel afraid and alone. Ileana was forced out of the surgery during Kai's first fits of life. After he finally calmed down, she returned to the surgery, which drove Kai into a rage once again. He blamed Ileana for the Matri retreat at Vahara, and thus the entire massacre. I was unaware at the time, but he had launched a mental attack against Ileana, cursing her in the most vile ways and sending graphic images of her death at his hands. She made a hasty retreat and gave us space to reconnect. I painstakingly detailed the final events of what was known across the sector as the Massacre of Vahara. I explained how Ileana had forced a portal-capable Matri to take her back to the battle. Arriving on the Lona Astrape, she had joined Taj, Rake, and Tolaire on their daring flight across the battlefield in a poorly armed shuttle determined to rescue the crew of the Pollux. They had managed to drag Kerr off my dying body with their shuttle and tossed him to the lifeless planet, then piloted the Pollux to safety. The only Hada ships to survive those last few hours of battle had been the Castapollux and the Lona Astrape, escaping through a portal created by the Matri Ileana coerced. Had it not been for Ileana's healing, nearly burning out her magic in the process, I would not have survived. Kai was shocked to hear that he had been mysteriously frozen between life and death, and only Ileana's friendship and determination to solve Kai's mystery had helped maintain my sanity. I watched his expression settle into reluctant acceptance as I explained the years immediately following the battle, and how Ileana and I had searched every possible lead to understand how he had been frozen into a magical stasis. As the years passed and the leads grew thin, Ileana never failed to visit. I tried to explain she was not the enemy, but Ileana was now my family. Kai was not pleased with the revelation. Kai locked himself in his cabin, scouring through every historical record of the last 30 years he could find. He had even gone so far as to access the ship's personal logs, listening to the private entries from Ileana and myself. When he did venture out of his quarters, Kai was quarrelsome and petulant. He complained about the upgrades I had made to the ship. We fought over my decision to guard his body in isolation. Then Kai spent hours in the training room rebuilding his strength and expelling his rage. Through the centuries, it had been Kai who had cared for and protected me. I was always the one off-kilter and unpredictable, while he was the strategic and even-tempered brother. Now that he was the one in need, I was at a complete loss as how best to help him. Ileana, however, had a firm grasp on the situation. It was she who initiated the plotting and asked Didi to shadow Kai. The little Neshi refused to leave his side. Didi fetched him food and blood and became his companion, even providing counsel, as much as she was able. Ileana kept her distance, allowing her familiar to bridge the gap. Then she slowly made her presence known, sharing the training room and joining us for dinner in the mess. When she discovered Kai's violation into her logs, Ileana gave Kai a very stern piece of her mind. I'm still a little confused how that argument led to their alliance, but the following day the two locked themselves in Kai's cabin for the entire afternoon. It would have been encouraging, or even amusing, had I not known what they were planning. Ileana's proposal, made the day before Kai had been resurrected, still hung between us. Through the chaos of the past few days, I had yet to inform her of my decision. So, the impatient woman naturally decided to recruit my brother in her efforts to drag me back into the hottest struggle. It wasn't a stretch for Kai to be an eager partner in her ploy. In addition to catching up on the years he had missed, Kai was also hunting the current whereabouts of our nemesis Kerr, who had somehow managed to survive Vihara. Kai had been awake only a handful of days, and already he was planning retaliation. In the weeks and months following Vihara, I felt a similar need, but Kai's condition proved enough of a distraction to dissuade me. My brother had nothing but his festering revenge for Vihara and a persistent need to find meaning for the years lost in sleep. When I confronted him, the conversation had not gone as expected. Kai admitted his once calm and strategic demeanor had been altered by the coma. Now he was impatient and filled with fury. Consumed by a revenge-fueled rage, Kai had become more akin to the beast for which I am known. I'm quite familiar with those feelings, and it broke my heart to know that through these last 30 years our roles somehow reversed. Kai was honest and blunt in his self-appraisal, giving me hope of a swift recovery. That hope was dashed when Kai refused to speak with our parents, a serious sign of worry. However, it was Kai's insistence that I take command of the Pollux and assume the position of first captain that gave me the greatest cause for concern. Since our maiden voyage, the position of first captain had always been held by Kai, and I always assumed the position of second captain. We often held equal positions in the military, but the Pollux was my brother's pride and joy. Now he believed the job beyond his capabilities and relinquished the role with little doubt. The former Kai would have never given over control of his ship, not even to me. I suspected he had more at play than honesty and recovery in his diminished role. My brother had no intentions of giving up his goal of vengeance, a goal that was bound to get him killed. With his focus solely on his newfound mission, he refused to recognize his weakened position and disadvantages. Brother by marriage, Kai was a physical-feeding raka, a vampyre. He required blood for sustenance the same way a vampyre needed to feed on a person's energy. Upon waking, Kai had consumed a total of 18 pouches of blood. In all our lives he had never exceeded 5, not even to heal his most serious injuries. Before his sleep, Kai's normal intake had dwindled with age to roughly 1 bag a week. Although his consumption dropped since first waking, he was still drinking between 3 to 4 bags a day. At this rate, we were going to need a replenished stock long before schedule. Additionally, Kai's fighting condition was far from optimal. His full strength had not yet returned. His speed was slower than usual, his form was rushed and gave fatal openings to an opponent. He was distracted by passion and pain. My brother needed time to adjust his skills to accommodate his new temperament. The only way to keep Kai safe, even from himself, was to plan one step ahead, which meant I needed Ileana on my side, not allied with Kai. I couldn't blame her for reaching out to my brother as a cohort in her plot. Since I still had not addressed her request, I feared Ileana felt insecure in her future. Kai's sudden appearance after years of just she and I to keep each other company had to be a difficult adjustment. Ileana didn't care about revenge or redemption. Her goal was far simpler. She wanted survival, for both of us. Her kind heart and compulsion to heal might prefer an active role in the struggles of the sector, but she would be just as happy to find adventure wandering the stars. The problem with Ileana is that the woman tended to let her big heart lead her into trouble. That blasted witch she called a best friend should never have let her stay among the camps for so long. After Kai had woken, she had sent word to the witch that she would be extending her recovery trip. Days after her arrival, and dark circles still lay beneath her bright green eyes, signaling her mental shields were still in desperate need of repair. I have no idea how she managed to survive the camps, but I refused to let her march into madness. Before Vihara, I had been fond of the young woman. After Vihara, she became a sister. I've already lost one sister in this life, and I have no intention of losing another. Aside from my parents, Kai and Ileana were the two people I loved most in this universe. 2 people who were on a mission to turn my life upside down and inside out. 2 people who were family and crew, and whose lives rested in my hands. It had been more than 200 years since I had abandoned my position as commander in the Keddy military. Now more than ever I would need those hard-earned skills to keep my mutinous crew alive. I left the quiet peace of my cabin and walked the short distance to Ileana's hatch and pressed the comm alerting her to my presence. Ileana opened the hatch with a confused look on her face. "I've granted you access to the personal logs for both Kai and myself from the last 5 days. She opened her mouth to protest, and I held up a hand to continue. "Read them, Lee. It's important we are all on equal footing. Kai has relinquished his control of the Pollux, and I've assumed command as first captain. Report to the war room for our first meeting tomorrow morning at 0800. Bring D." A small smile bloomed across her face. "Time to go find my rebellious brother." Blue light from the central aquarium bounced off the walls and hatches of the dim Deck 3 inner hub. I made a mental note to place an order of live fish for the journey. The current levels could sustain a small crew, but it was best to be prepared for anything. The ship was still running for power conservation, both to save fuel cells and avoid detection, leaving only essential systems such as the aquaponics, hydroponics, and life support running. Lights were a non-essential power drain. While I was accustomed to the dark, Kai and Ileana were not. For the last several days, they randomly began activating lights throughout the ship, which I was forced to turn off when discovered. It had become an annoying battle of wills, symbolizing their desire to escape this dark asteroid and my steadfast refusal to be coerced. Rounding the center of the inner hub, I walked the short distance to Kai's cabin and pressed the visitor alert button. He didn't respond. I tried again, to which he still didn't respond. Not in the mood for the delay, I opened the access panel and overrode the security measures. The hatch slid open. Standing at the entrance of Kai's once orderly cabin, I was dumbfounded by the sight before me. The deep burgundy curtains, which had previously lined his entire room, were now in piles on the deck, hanging off his bed and strewn across his desk. Kai was standing on his old-world bed, dirty boots leaving stains on his antique embroidered bedding while he leaned against one of the intricately carved wooden posts and typed into his datapad. The content of his notes were being input directly onto one of the wall displays. Every cabin on the Pollux was lined with cabinets and drawers built into the walls that featured programmable viz displays on the front. Most crew members picked images of family, home, or a full wall mural to decorate their room. Kai was using his displays for notes, specifically notes on Kerr's whereabouts. Every single panel featured a lead or rumor from someone across the common, reporting to have spotted the mercenary. From what I could tell, he was getting dangerously close to locating our nemesis. I leaned against the wall, watching him flit from note to note, his lips twisted and brow furrowed in thought. Kai ran a hand through his hair, pulling in frustration. From the looks of his curls standing at every conceivable angle, it was something he had been doing all day. His shirt buttons were unaligned, his pants hung half open around his hips, and he hadn't shaved since waking. The poised and polished politician, aptly dubbed the Blood Prince, was nowhere to be seen. Kai spun, scanning the walls for a previous note, and finally noticed me standing in the room. "Oh, hi," he said absently, jumping from the bed to read a note positioned over his desk. "Hello," I replied. "Brother, this obsession is becoming... I've almost found him. Unhealthy." I finished my sentence and sighed. "I thought you were going to let this go." "Let it go?" Kai nearly shrieked, waving his hand around the room. "Not when I'm this close. I've tracked him up to 5 years ago when he left the Raqqa mercenary forces, then disappeared. There have been random sightings since, but none of them form a definite path." He was one well-placed contact away from discovering Kerr's new position. This was a path I couldn't let him walk. It wasn't just about duty to family or because he had been the one to pull me back from the brink 1,000 times. Forcing Kai to find himself again was also a measure of self-preservation. The Hada needed him. They needed his skills in negotiation. They needed his mind and heart to help save them. I could step into his boots temporarily, but leading the Hada simply wasn't in my nature. It wasn't my life's purpose the way it was for Kai, or rather, the way it once was for him. Truthfully, after 500 years, I was still looking for my life's purpose. I wasn't lying to Ileana when I admitted to finding the thought of fighting again unappealing. Watching Kai frantically search for his revenge was exhausting, and it only reinforced my certainty that this life was no longer one I craved. I would support and defend the Hada cause until the day I died, but it wasn't enough. I could no longer deny that something was missing. "Kai, could you please stop for a minute?" I asked. He darted back across the room and compared a note against whatever he was reading on his datapad. He ignored me, lost in thought. I growled to catch his attention, without success. "Kai!" I shouted. "What?" He startled, briefly glancing at me, then back to his datapad. I marched over to the bed where he was once again standing among the disheveled mess and snatched the datapad from his hands. "Luke!" he shouted in protest. "Meeting in the war room at 0800 tomorrow morning," I growled, adding the entry into his datapad. "And clean up this mess. It's a safety hazard." I tossed the device back to him and charged out of the cabin. 2 hours later, I was finally back in my bunk, eager to find sleep. If I were honest with myself, sleep wasn't the only lure to return to my bed. After several days, the dream woman's scent was beginning to fade from my sheets. I desperately needed to soak up the last remnants of her presence. I couldn't explain why an imaginary dream scent lingered in reality, and I didn't particularly want an explanation. I just wanted the scent to stay. I knew I should have mentioned it to Ileana and insist she check my health. Imaginary scents were not a good sign for my sanity, but allowing her to heal me, to wipe away the scent I craved, just the thought made me nauseous. I buried my nose in the pillow and moaned. Why couldn't I let this go? Her scent was like an addiction I didn't have the will to kick. There were better things to do than hunt a dream that refused to return. Plans needed to be made, supplies to be ordered, upgrades to complete, and all I wanted to do was lie in bed and remember the feel of an imaginary woman's body pressed against mine. I was chasing an illusion, but that sliver of illusion was so much more appealing than reality. I let go of the pillow and flipped onto my back. I needed to get my head in order. My conversation with Kai was still irritating me. He was getting worse, and if I let him continue, he was going to run headlong into trouble. I just hoped my plan would pull him out of this obsession. Just as I closed my eyes to sink into sleep, a constant alert rang through my cabin, accompanied by a firm pounding on my hatch. I groaned and pressed the bedside button to release the hatch. Ileana slipped through the partially opened hatch, hair mussed and eyes wild. "I don't think it was a dream," she announced breathlessly. "Are you having nightmares again?" I asked, concerned the horrors that slipped through her mental shields were once again plaguing her. "No," she huffed. "Your dream. I listened to the logs." She paused to inspect me lying in bed, still fully clothed. "Well, at least I know why you've been sleeping more lately." I groaned. This was not a conversation I wanted to be having. "Lee, I gave you the logs to listen to, but that didn't mean I wanted to discuss them." "You should know me better than that by now," she responded with a droll look. "What if it wasn't a dream?" "Of course it was a dream," I said, sitting up and leaning against the back wall. When the woman gets an idea in her head, there was no turning her off it. This was going to be a long night. I fell asleep and was in the White Room, then woke up in my bed. It was a very vivid dream, most likely due to my impending insanity, but still just a dream. "But what if it was more?" She sat on the end of my bed and began to twist her fingers together. "You're not a normal Keddy, Luke. I know you don't want to hear this, but what if it was a premonition or a prophecy of some sort?" "You know I hate the P word, Lee," I growled. Just because a psychotic scientist turned me into the beast based on one prophecy does not mean that I have the ability myself. I'm not implying Decimus gave you a matre gift, she said with a scowl, but neither of us knows what he really did to you or any of his other experiments. Maybe this woman was another one of his victims and you two are somehow tied together. For a beat, the idea stirred something deep in my heart. The hope that the woman was real, that we were destined, was intensely powerful and all-consuming. Then reality shattered the dream. All of Decimus's experiments were accounted for. All but one our people were never able to track down, and that subject had been male. All were dead, all but me. The woman was just a dream I needed to forget. And why then am I only dreaming of her now, 550 years later? I rubbed my eyes, already weary of this conversation. I think it's more likely that I've lived in isolation on this asteroid far longer than any man should, and my mind is making up imaginary women for lack of the real thing. Ileana bit her lip and dropped her head back against the wall. You never know, she finally whispered. I chuckled at her endless supply of tender optimism. Ileana was romantic to the core. There wasn't a man alive who could live up to her imagination, but it wouldn't stop her from believing everyone had a perfect mate. I admired her hope, and I feared for the broken heart she was destined. The way you described her, I've never heard you speak so passionately, Luke. I avoided her probing gaze. When I recorded the log directly after waking from the dream, I hadn't anticipated anyone but myself ever listening to it. The experience had been so fresh and so real in my mind. I could still feel her fingers wrapped with mine. Her scent was still an intoxicant clouding my mind. I knew when Lee listened to the log I was bound to experience a little teasing. I did not expect her to join me in feeding the illusion. Can we please stop discussing this? I asked, praying she wouldn't make me kick her out, or worse, beg her to stop. Thankfully, she knew me well enough to know that I had reached my limits. She dipped her head in a slight nod of acquiescence. Go to bed, Lee. We have a big day tomorrow. We're leaving the asteroid, aren't we? She smiled and kicked her feet excitedly. I refused to reply. She would have to work harder than that for me to give up the advantage. I wasn't naive enough to think my meeting announcement would put a stop to Kai and Ileana's plotting. Go to sleep, Lee, I firmly said again. She stood and headed toward the hatch with a pout. Pressing the hatch release button, she turned, and her lips curled in a half-smile. If she is real, then we won't find your mate while wasting away inside this asteroid. Think about that, Lucien Rival. The hatch closed behind her, and I let out a long sigh. If I didn't know better, I could have sworn the telepath was reading my mind. Subscribe to continue listening and discover Luke's plans for his new crew. If you liked what you heard, the Uncommon ebook can be purchased at all major retailers for only 99 cents. Thank you for listening.